couple years ago, I was taking apart some old benches I no longer had any use for, and it occurred to me that they had held up for a long time despite being held together with drywall screws. In fact, I've built a lot of shop-related stuff with drywall screws over the years. The most striking example is some lofts in my old workshop. The main beams, the joist hangers, even the ceiling ties relied entirely upon the strength of drywall screws to support an obscene amount of weight once I loaded them up with hardwood and other stuff. And they remained full like that for years without so much as a creak. Of course, just because my stuff didn't come crashing down on my head does not mean it's safe to use drywall screws in structural applications. You absolutely should not do that. But I have no problem using them to build benches, and even I've hidden a drywall screw or two in strategic places in furniture and cabinetry projects, as I'm sure you have too. So the question is, are the higher priced construction screws, such as GRK and Spax, worth the cost if you aren't building something structural, such as framing a house or a deck? Do the fancy features of those screws, such as their fluted points, their serrated teeth, the complex head geometry, does this make any difference at all for most day-to-day projects? Well, I did some testing back then, and I learned some unexpected things that completely changed how I used screws. Seriously, after this video, you will never look at a screw the same way again. For example, here I'm driving a bunch of drywall screws into hard maple. Now granted, this test isn't really fair to the drywall screw because I'd never drive screws into hardwood like this without a pilot hole. And as expected, I got lots of splitting along the grain. Then I did the same thing with just simple coated deck screws, which have an added feature, a fluted tip that's designed to bore its own pilot hole of sorts. Now these screws didn't split the maple as much, but while those tips did cut the wood fibers, they don't seem to excavate the tiny chips from the hole, and so the effect was pretty minimal. But the Spax screws have no fluted points. Instead, they feature uniquely serrated threads. These seem to chew up the wood fibers more effectively and auger them up and out of the hole, which provides clearance for the screw shaft and all but eliminates splitting even in very hardwood. Note how you can see more tiny wood chips around the Spax screw heads. It's a very clever design that made a big difference. Score 1 for their patented serrated threads. But that doesn't mean there's no value to a fluted tip. The GRK screws have a fluted tip, but rather than fully serrated threads, because those are patented, these feature a few notches stamped here and there. This does seem to be like a hybrid between the fluted deck screw and that serrated Spax screw. The tip severs the fibers ahead of the screw, and the notched threads help excavate the chips. The results weren't as good as the serrated threads, but they were certainly better than fluted tips alone. As you look at the different types of screws I tested, you might notice the heads are set to different levels. This wasn't intentional. I used the same clutch setting on all of them. I drove them with the same force, and I didn't stop any of the screws before the drill clutch engaged. So that brought to the forefront some of the differences between the various head designs. A drywall screw features a bugle-shaped head that's designed to compress the paper of a sheet of drywall without tearing it. The rest of the screws have conical-shaped heads that are better suited for compressing wood fibers with a radial wedging action, or even cutting those fibers, depending on the head's texture. It is the drywall screw's flatter head profile that makes it appear more deeply embedded in the surface of the maple than, say, the deck screw. But in reality, that bugle head is its weakness. If I turn off the drill's clutch and I try to force the drywall screw heads into the surface of the wood, that flatter profile resists. Some of the heads snap off, others just hold onto the surface until the threads strip out the fibers within the hole and they lose their grip. The coated deck screws, on the other hand, feature a large double bevel beneath its head. This is supposed to ease it into the wood, the steeper portion beginning to spread and compress the fibers, followed by the shallower bevel, which fits a common 45-degree countersink coming in behind. There are also slight ridges around the head of a deck screw to help sever some of those fibers. These differences in head design enabled it to embed below the surface of the white oak without a pre-bored countersink. I drove them as deeply as I could before the threads finally stripped out the hole and in one case a head snapped off. Now the Spax screws and the GRK screws feature single bevel heads. These might not spread the fibers as efficiently as the deck screws dual bevels, but they do displace less wood overall. And they also feature more fiber shredding ribs, the GRK version being by far the most aggressive, and that made a difference. Unlike the GRK screws, the Spax screws struggled a bit to embed themselves in the hardwood. None broke, but all of them stripped out their holes and the threads lost their gripping power before the heads were fully below the surface. Another factor in that poor performance may be that less than half the Spax screw shaft is threaded compared to 2/3 of the GRK and 3/4 of the deck screw. The bare portion of that shaft is designed to help pull two boards together, but fewer threads can also mean less gripping power. And as expected, the GRK screws did embed themselves more fully. In fact, I was able to sink them below the surface without stripping out their holes at all, something none of the other screws could do. This was surprising because the deck screws have slightly coarser threads and more of them. You'd expect these to produce more holding force inside the hole. And they might if you're careful not to overdrive them, because it did seem that it was the deck screw's larger head, not necessarily the threads, that stopped it from going deeper. On the other hand, the more aggressive cutting design of the GRK head works along with its threads to bore into the wood without stripping the hole. This is an important point. Any of these screws in this test will hold a massive amount of weight by virtue of their threads alone. But when it comes to true holding power, you've got to consider the other factors we've discussed. The more a screw splits the wood fibers around the hole, the less it can grip the wood. And the easier it strips out the fibers within the hole, something directly related to head geometry, the more likely the screw will pull out of that hole later. That's why I ran these tests in this way. I think they brought out the subtle, and sometimes not so subtle, differences between modern screw features and highlighted some things you may not have considered that can have a significant effect upon a screw's performance. So to summarize it all, drywall screws are strong enough in and of themselves for non-structural projects, but they lack some important features that might otherwise make the joint stronger. For example, fluted tips and serrated threads help reduce fiber separation around the hole that may weaken a screw's grip where no pilot hole has been bored. The Spax screws especially excelled at this. I also think the more aggressive the cutting geometry under the screw head, the better, even if you use a countersink bit, because you might slightly overdrive your screw, and if the head can't effectively sever more fibers and go deeper, you may unknowingly strip the hole and weaken your joint. The GRK screws had the best head design in this respect. But perhaps the most important lesson is the benefits of using a pilot hole in a countersink with a driver that has a clutch feature, because these can cancel out many of the subtle differences and improve the grip of even drywall screws. I think it's all very interesting. Now here's something else that's interesting. Several years ago, I started using rotor bits with Astra protective coating. And over the years, I've become a believer in how Astra coating can make bits just last longer. So I was excited to learn that there is a new version called Astra HP coating. It's not just about looking cool, although that does look pretty cool. Astra HP is a microscopically thin, ultra-hard coating that's added to premium white-side bits to reduce friction and heat buildup and the resulting premature wear that is caused by that. This leads to longer bit life overall, but where it really stands out to me is how it affects the performance drop-off that comes after a typical bit is used a few times and becomes less than factory sharp. I like it on my most used bits, like flush trim bits and pattern bits, or bits that I use in my CNC, or any bit that you just find yourself reaching for regularly. So here's what I recommend. Use the link below this video to get maybe just one straight spiral bit with the new Astra HP coating. The spiral bits are the workhorses in most shops. Get whichever style you're going to use the most, flush trim, compression, pattern cutting, whatever. Maybe just invest in one and try it for yourself. Then you can decide if it's worth adding more of these to your collection. I know I will be.